Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Tonight on Farage, the government intends to push ahead with Sizewell C. We'll debate whether we think it's a good idea or a bad idea and ask you whether you're behind the move. And a big royal theme tonight, the Queen will not be in Buckingham Palace next week to see, we think, Liz Truss as the next Prime Minister, her 15th. She'll stay in Balmoral. Well, our should we be worried? And Lee Sansom, who was a bodyguard to Princess Diana of Wales, joins us tonight on the 25th anniversary of the night of her fatal accident. But before all of that, let's get the news.
Hello, I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Former Manchester United footballer Ryan Giggs faces a possible retrial after a jury failed to reach a verdict in his domestic violence case. The 48-year-old had denied physical assault and coercive behaviour against his ex-girlfriend Kate Greville. He's been released on bail until a hearing next week. Military ties between the UK and Australia are being strengthened, with the two countries training together. Australians will join the Royal Navy on 5 new submarines, including HMS Anson, which was built at a cost of £1.3 billion. It follows the trilateral agreement with the US, a partnership which the Prime Minister says will help secure jobs in Britain.
That is the first time we've ever done something like this, and that's part of this massive deal that we've done with Australia and with America, the AUKUS program, so that together we hope to be building the next generation of submarines after this one that will be driving jobs and growth in Barrow and elsewhere for really decades and decades to come.
For the first time in her reign, the Queen will stay in Scotland to appoint a new Prime Minister next week. Boris Johnson and his successor will travel to Balmoral instead of the traditional meeting at Buckingham Palace. The announcement comes in the last few days of the Tory leadership race, with Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak going head-to-head for the final hustings in London tonight. New figures show food prices are rising at the fastest rate since the financial crisis in 2008. The British Retail Consortium says the annual increase in fresh food costs jumped to 10.5%, up from 8% in July, with milk and margarine among the products worst affected. The war in Ukraine is being blamed for the additional pressure on prices. More travel chaos is expected, with another round of rail strikes being announced. Members of the train drivers' union ASLEF are planning to walk off the job on September the 15th, which will affect 12 companies. Another union, the TSSA, has also announced workers from another 9 train companies are also taking industrial action on the 26th. The funeral of the Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, will take place on Saturday. That's according to Russian news agencies. The Kremlin is yet to decide whether it will be a state funeral. World leaders have been paying tribute to Mr. Gorbachev, who helped end the Cold War. It will now be harder for Russians to get visas to the EU. Foreign ministers decided to suspend an agreement with Russia that eases visa issuance. This will make it more complicated and costly for Russian citizens to enter the EU. However, according to diplomats, there will not be a general visa ban. TV, online and DAB Plus radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to Farage.
Well, for roughly 20 years, I've been saying I thought there was a threat the lights could go out in this country. I've had no confidence in any government energy policy ever since the days of Tony Blair. It seems to me the more wind turbines we build, the more vulnerable we become when the wind doesn't blow. And in terms of nuclear, we were a country that very much led the world in nuclear energy technology back in the 50s and 60s. But what we've been doing over the last few years is not reinvesting, and they've gradually been becoming old and obsolete and shutting down. Now, what's the upside of nuclear? The upside is you get base load. You know with a nuclear power station exactly how much electricity it's going to produce 24 hours a day. But it's an issue that raises very, very strong emotions on both sides of the argument. Yes, of course, it's CO2 free, but there are many worried, and perhaps what happened in Fukushima a few years ago, in Japan, what happened prior to that in Russia, all of these things, nuclear accidents, 3 Mile Island, these are some of the great fears. But at last, a British government has done something decisive. And this government is pushing ahead with frankly, they've ignored normal planning rules, and Sizewell C on the Suffolk coast is to go ahead. Now, it's estimated to cost about £30 billion. The British government will take a 20% stake in it. That as opposed to the Chinese taking a 20% stake, which I do applaud. EDF, the French energy giant, they'll come in with 20%. They hope the rest of the money can be raised through pension funds and other investors. But is it the right place? Is it the right technology? My question for you at home is, do you support the plans for Sizewell C? Please let me know your views. Farage@gbnews.uk. Now, we're going to hear both sides of this argument and let you make your mind up on this. And let's go right now to Suffolk. Let's speak to Pete Wilkinson, who is part of Together Against Sizewell C. And Pete is a campaigner. Pete, the floor is yours. What is wrong? You've had Sizewell A, you've had Sizewell B. It's produced lots of money, lots of jobs in the local Suffolk economy. What on earth is wrong with moving on to Sizewell C?
There were no miraculous regeneration of the area after Sizewell A or Sizewell B, of course. It's still pretty run down in that area. What's wrong with it is the fact that it's a massive development on the Suffolk coast, on an eroding coast, in a flood zone. There are still investigations going on to find out whether the land upon which it is being built, or it's planned to be built, is actually stable enough to hold the weight of the nuclear power station. It's going to have a massive impact in this area. It's an infringement on the area of outstanding natural beauty. It will impact directly the RSPB Minsmere Reserve, which is world-renowned. It's going to impact special sites of special scientific interest. It's going to bring 12.1 million tonnes of aggregate from the West Country into an isolated spot on the East Coast at vast cost. You said it was, in your introduction, Nigel, you said it was carbon-free. Sadly, it's not at all. And even if it were, by 2035, which is when Sizewell C is first mooted to bring the first kilowatt of electricity to the grid, the whole of the energy sector will be carbon-free by law. That's what Boris has told us.
Really?
So the impact of, yes, absolutely. That's what he said. By 2035, the whole of the energy sector will be carbon-free.
Pete, let me just stop you for a sec.
It's going to be a benefit. Yeah, go on.
Let me just stop you for a sec. I understand your concerns about the environment. By the way, I've been to Minsmere myself. I've seen the avocets nesting there. I understand what you're saying. However, we are facing, a very major problem with power generation in this country. It's so serious that the lights could even go out next February if a big anticyclone sits over the North Sea and the Suffolk coast. And I understand that building motaways and building power stations, these are horrible, ugly things.
The last time we heard about it, they were supposed to go out in 2017. Didn't go out. We haven't built anything since 2017.
Already in Germany. Well, if you don't think we've got an energy problem, John, well, I'm afraid you're wrong. In Germany, already we're seeing power rationing. We have to sort ourselves out. The idea that all electricity generation by 2035 is going to be carbon-free is baloney. We need something. Are you Let me just ask you a second question. Boris will be gone next Tuesday, thank goodness, and we won't have to put up with his ludicrous energy policy, which has perhaps been the single worst thing he's done. John, I understand. If I lived on the Suffolk coast, I'd be very very thoughtful. I get your point. These are great, big, ugly structures. I'm very familiar with Dungeness A and B in Kent. I get those points. I understand it. It's a beautiful stretch of coastline in Suffolk. I get all of that. But let me ask you one more question. Do you object to nuclear energy as an industry, or is it just the siting of it in Sizewell?
Oh, as an industry. I mean, it's the other side of the nuclear weapons argument. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the Science Policy Research Unit at Sussex University did a study on what actually drives the fixation that the government has with nuclear power. And they looked at it from every angle, from cost to environment to jobs, every angle. And the only thing they could come up with is that it's so important to the nuclear weapons industry because it keeps the knowledge base and it keeps the supply chain for the renewal of Trident going, without which we wouldn't have Trident available to us in the next 20, 30 years. Wow. It's the other side of the nuclear weapons argument.
I think you'll find, actually, that the Trident nuclear technology is more American than it is UK. John, stay there. Stay there and hear a counter-argument that's now going to be put by Brendan Chilton, CEO of the Independent Business Network, director at the economic think tank, the Institute for Prosperity, and still a serving Labour councillor.
I am indeed.
Tell me, Brendan, you've heard what John's had to say. I can understand.
Yep.
If it's being built in my backyard, I might not be very happy. I mean, I get that, and I get that for bypasses and motorways, but we're living in the 21st century. What are the arguments? I mean, John made the point that actually lots of carbon is used in building them, and I get that. However, once they're generating, they're carbon-free. But what is the big argument that you would say for this project?
Well, right now, Nigel, this country is experiencing an energy crisis like we have never seen in our lifetimes. We are being told, as you've just said, the lights could go out as early as February next year, and at the moment the government haven't lifted the moratorium on fracking, and so we've got a limited number of options here. We can't continue to have energy coming into this country from despotic regimes that have proven to be unreliable. We need to become energy self-sufficient. Once this extra plant has been built down on the Suffolk coast, those combined will be responsible for up to 15% of the UK's energy needs. Now, I totally understand. I've sat on the planning committee for 10 years. Local residents, doesn't matter where you are, it could be a house extension or, in this case, a nuclear power plant. They don't like development. But we've got to look at the bigger picture here. How can we be in a situation right now where British industry, British businesses could be going bust because they cannot afford the energy that we're currently having to pay?
Well, the argument against that would be that whilst nuclear produces electricity that is CO2-free, and whilst nuclear gives you an absolutely guaranteed base load, as opposed to the intermittency of wind or solar, the argument against it is it's actually quite expensive.
Yes, I appreciate that the initial capital costs are very expensive. But again, we've got to look at the longevity of it. The nuclear plant can last for many, many years. I live in Kent. Dungeness is not far from me. I've been there for donkey's years and has done a good job in supplying energy to this country. France has got a much larger portion of its energy supply coming from nuclear, and they're not in the position that we're in. I would also say, you know, in terms of the size here, a nuclear power plant is much smaller than an enormous wind turbine minefield. Many of them which now surround the country and blight our countryside. I would much rather have one smaller size for a nuclear plant than an entire country full of windmills.
Fair point. So back to Pete Wilkinson. Pete, you know, Brendan makes this point. That actually compared to, you know, a vast wind array, it's a relatively small area. But here's the really important question I want to ask you. We have to have more energy generation. I think all of us can agree on that. If not Sizewell C, what would you propose?
Well, the first thing is to ask your guest there, how many of the French nuclear plants are operating today? 50% are closed down for faults. So the reliability argument is nonsense, and so is the CO2 argument, Nigel, that you keep going back to. It's not carbon-free by any manner of means. And as I said already...
Hang on, Pete. Energy generation is CO2-free. Go on.
At the point it's burnt, that's absolutely right, when you put the uranium in the reactors. But either side of that, look at what you're going to do with 42,000 tonnes of spent nuclear fuel if Boris gets his way on 24 gigawatts of nuclear-generated electricity. What are you going to do with 42,000 tonnes of spent nuclear fuel?
Where is the energy going to come from? Where is the energy going to come from if we don't build projects like Sizewell C?
What successive governments should have been doing over the last 20, 30 years is to look at the demand side of the energy argument. Instead of continuing to build supply, we've got to drive down demand. And we can do that. It's already happening. It's 16% less electricity than over the last 10 years, and we can drive it down. There's 30% slack in the energy argument.
And
to be quite honest with you, I'm so disappointed to hear from this Labour councillor that he doesn't even have the vision or the sort of energy or the political backbone to look at the jobs issue. The Sizewell C will cost you will produce 900 long-term jobs, and the cost of those long-term jobs for 900 people, which is very, very small number, I'm sure you agree, £22 million for each job. That's not a sensible investment.
Actually, I tell you what, Pete, 900 very well-paid jobs in a remote part of Suffolk actually makes a huge difference to the economy of that area. If you go up to Sellafield in the northwest, I mean, goodness me, the money those men earn and women earn keeps the whole area going. I understand your argument. We must drive down demand. I see completely where you're coming from. I get your passion. I thank you for coming on and debating this with me on GB News. Brendan, I thank you too for coming on and debating this. But I think, in a sense, at the end there with Pete Wilkinson, we got the real reason why people are opposed to nuclear energy. Actually, amongst the Green movement in this country, they want our living standards to go backwards. They don't want us driving around in cars. They don't want us heating our homes to 20 degrees centigrade. They don't want us having lots of gizmos and lots of gadgets. They want to take us back in time. And I don't think that a first world, 21st century country wants to do that. I have to say, despite the cost, despite the reservations, I think we have been woefully inadequate in investing in nuclear. Unless you can give me some other way of getting reliable base load energy. And that, I guess, would be reopening coal-fired power stations. I would say nuclear, probably in that context, is the lesser of two evils. Now, next week, we will have a new Prime Minister. It'll be the Queen's 15th Prime Minister, but she won't be accepting the new PM in Buckingham Palace. It'll take place in Balmoral. We'll find out why. We'll also pay tribute to a man who died yesterday at the age of 91. I believe Mikhail Gorbachev was a very great man. We'll discuss his life in a moment too. Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, a passionate debate about whether Sizewell C is a good idea, whether nuclear energy is a good idea. I asked you whether you would support the Sizewell C project. Pat says most definitely. Millsy says, I rather agree with this, yes, but it's 12 years too late from their party. Reactive, not proactive, as usual. Yes, Millsy, you're absolutely right. People have been talking about this for the best part of 20 years, not 12. Archie says, yes, I want it in public ownership. I want all nuclear and renewables in public ownership. Well, Archie, if you think the government could organise our energy supply better than the private sector, good for you. I'd be a little bit sceptical given the way they run pretty much everything else. And another viewer says, yes, should have been signed off 5 years ago. I do detect, actually, that when it comes to nuclear power, there's been quite a big shift in this country, in America and elsewhere. Kind of Fukushima is a few years ago. It should never have been built on a fault. And I think there is growing support for the idea of nuclear energy. That's the take that I've got. Now, last night we learned that Mikhail Gorbachev had died at the age of 91. He was a truly remarkable figure, the last president of the Soviet Union. And you know, he oversaw the breakup of that union. He'd been in the previous 10 years, in relative terms, for the Soviet Union, an enlightened figure. Glasnost, perestroika, and opening up. And interestingly, in 1984, he accepted an invitation to come and meet Mrs. Thatcher in London. Let's have a brief look at the life and times, particularly in the 1980s, of Mikhail Gorbachev.
I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together. We both believe in our own political systems. He firmly believes in his, I firmly believe in mine.
General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Well, Reagan's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. They are the words from the whole of the Reagan presidency I will remember more than absolutely anything else. And blow me down, 2 years later, the wall did come down. And Mikhail Gorbachev, who to me was a great international hero, had a vision of a modern Russia that would transform itself into a full modern democracy. Well, sadly, today it has become anything but. And the oddest thing about Gorbachev is, despite the great things that he did, he actually became a somewhat maligned, ignored figure in his own country of Russia. And it's a strange thing in life. Often those that do great things don't get rewarded in their lifetimes for what they've done, but get remembered very well in history. Well, talk about this, and to talk in particular about how the Iron Lady, that was what Mrs. Thatcher was known as, the Iron Lady, standing up to the Soviet Union. How is it that Mrs. Thatcher came to respect that man and said, as you saw in the clip, in 1984, he's a man I can do business with? But joining me from Washington, D.C. is Niall Gardner, a former aide to Margaret Thatcher and now director of the Margaret Thatcher Centre for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation there in D.C. Niall, welcome to the programme. It was an extraordinary thing, wasn't it, in 1984 for the Iron Lady to invite the President of the Soviet Union to come to London for a conference?
Well, Nigel, thanks very much for having me on the show today. And as you point out, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev, a hugely important historic figure, played a key role in the end of the Cold War. And without a doubt, I think that had it not been for Gorbachev listening to the advice and the tremendous pressure, of course, of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, we would not have seen the end of the Soviet empire. And Margaret Thatcher recognized in Gorbachev, as you pointed out earlier in the clips that you've shown here on GB News, Margaret Thatcher saw Gorbachev as a figure she could do business with. At the same time, I think she was under no illusions with regard to what she was dealing with in terms of negotiating with a Soviet Russia. She absolutely hated the communist leadership of the Soviet Union, but she saw in Gorbachev somebody who was willing to compromise and to work with the West to bring about fundamental, far-reaching changes. But at the same time, she projected tremendous strength through increasing British defence spending by 25% or so between 1981 and 85. She worked with Ronald Reagan to really stand up to the most monstrously evil empire of our time, the Soviet Empire. So that strength and determination, resolve, I think, placed tremendous pressure upon Gorbachev to do the right thing, and ultimately he did. And certainly, Gorbachev's role in terms of bringing down the Soviet Empire is absolutely vital.
How is he perceived in America?
Well, I think that perceptions of Gorbachev certainly mixed. I mean, a huge amount of coverage, of course, in the United States, but he's widely remembered as the man who worked with Ronald Reagan to end the specter of Soviet communism. And if you look at Ronald Reagan's leadership during the Cold War, it was absolutely incredible. And many Americans would like to see that kind of leadership today. Unfortunately, of course, with Joe Biden, you have completely the opposite. Joe Biden is the antithesis of American leadership on the world stage. But it was Ronald Reagan's strength and determination, together with Margaret Thatcher, that really, I think, led to Gorbachev to implement, perestroika, the changes that we saw there inside the Soviet Union. So a great deal, I think, of analysis, reaction in the United States today to Gorbachev's death, but also, of course, most Americans remembering the great strength and leadership of Ronald Reagan, who played such a pivotal role in the downfall of Soviet communism.
They were remarkable days, and Niall, thank you for coming on and sharing with us thoughts about the life of Mikhail Gorbachev, who died yesterday at the age of 91. Now,
my pleasure.
Talking of nonagenarians, we have a Queen, of course, who is coming into her late 90s. And we'll know on Monday who the next Prime Minister is, and the next Prime Minister will take office on the 6th. But of course, vital constitutional part is played by the Queen, who has to meet the incoming and accept the incoming Prime Minister. Now, this will be the 15th Prime Minister that the Queen has met since she first took over as Queen. It's almost unbelievable to think that it's back at the time when Winston Churchill was Prime Minister. But with increasing concerns about her mobility, perhaps even her health more broadly, I don't know, what's going to happen is Liz Truss, and I think Boris Johnson before her, will have to go to Balmoral. But joining me is BBC's former royal correspondent, Michael Cole. Michael, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel. It was absurd, wasn't it, to think that the 96-year-old monarch could make an 800-mile round trip simply because the Tory party has been indulging in this ludicrously prolonged, extended election process. I wrote an article about this saying that this should happen, that they should together, Boris and the winner, have an away day to Royal Deeside on an RAF jet. You and I, the taxpayer, will be picking up the fare, and they should go there and see the monarch and do the business. And there is precedent. In 1908, the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, had to travel all the way to Biarritz to see King Edward VII because he was on holiday there, and he wasn't going to come back to London just because Asquith and the Liberal Party had got themselves in a fix. So Asquith had to make 6 rail journeys, 2 ferry crossings, and spent 4 days and had to eat interminable meals with King Tum Tum, as he was called, in order to do the business. And even in our own lifetime, and you'll probably remember it, the great crisis of 1963, a year of real political crisis, Her Majesty the Queen went to the hospital for officers in Harley Street, where Harold Macmillan was in his sickbed, and she accepted his resignation as Prime Minister there. He was so ill, Nigel, that he lived in more than another 20 years. But at that time, I think he was sick, mainly sick of politics after the Profumo scandal. And after that, the magic circle happened. And
OK, Michael, so basically, this is all a perfectly reasonable arrangement. We have got a couple of precedents in the past of things not happening in Buckingham Palace, and we shouldn't be that worried about the Queen's condition.
Well, I think she obviously has mobility issues. She's finding it's difficult to get around. Perhaps we all would if we're lucky to be spared to 96 years. But apparently she's as sharp as a tack. She's on the ball and she's able to conduct her business. What she's not able to do is race around the country at the behest of a Tory party. You know America. The Americans used to be so impressed that the change of regime was instant here. They spent 18 months electing a new president, and yet it used to be one prime minister goes out of one door and the other prime minister comes into the next, and seamlessly the regime goes on. I don't know why the Tory party has indulged in this thing. It was completely unnecessary. Everybody knew the candidates and could have cast their votes on day one.
Well, I know.
Gone through the straight rigmarole.
I have to say, Michael, the last 2 or 3 weeks have been a complete and absolute farce. They've handled this appallingly. I'm with you on that. And I think your explanation, actually, for why they should go and see the Queen is a rather good one, as I would expect from you, Michael Cole. And thank you again for joining us here on GB News. Now, last night I talked about a lack of medical care. I talked about the fact that you simply, in most parts of the country, can't get onto an NHS dentist list. Unless, of course, you've crossed the English Channel illegally by dinghy, and then you will get free dental care. It all makes you begin to wonder whether those that do wrong in some ways get treated better than those that do their best to obey the law and pay taxes. On TikTok today, we saw this video of a prisoner's cell. This is an up-to-date TikTok video. Now, albeit this is, an open prison, it's not a closed prison, but it does all look, well, I would say, pretty luxurious. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go back to the barbaric, bad old days, but I was a little bit surprised to see that once people leave prison, they're given an allowance, a handout, if you like, that it went up last year from £46 a week to £76 a week, and now offenders leaving jail will see their subsistence payment rise by 8.4% in recognition of the cost of living rising. And interesting, isn't it? That pay rise is double that given to nurses, police officers and firefighters. Now, joining me to discuss this is Mark Johnson, MBE, former prisoner and founder of the Young Offenders Charity, Use a Voice. You've been on this programme before. We've talked about these issues. I am not suggesting we treat prisoners in a barbaric way or anything else. But you get my point that when, I'm lumping it in with those that cross the channel and get dental care, and there are people out there doing not really very well paid jobs who they're doing their best. They're going to struggle like crazy. I mean, if you go to prison, you've got no gas bill, you've got no electricity bill. Is this right for ex-offenders to get these allowances and for them to be increased, Mark, by 8.4%?
Yeah, so, I mean, the story's 8.4%. In reality, is £6. It's increased by over a year.
Yes.
When I left prison in 1992, it was £36. So it hasn't gone up a great deal, regarding...
In relative terms, that was quite a lot then.
Yeah, it was, yeah. Yeah.
Interesting.
But when you look at 60% of people over the last 2 years have been released, 60% into unsettled accommodation, either none or settled. 1,300 prisoners released in London completely homeless with a tent and a carrier bag. When you look at it in that way, it's not a great deal of money, actually. The video I found was really unhelpful. When I looked at it, I looked at a very clean cell, which is what you want to see, people being taught decency and stuff. What I did see was a milk stacked up against the window. Now, each carton of those milk are 50p. If you're in prison today and you don't have a family sending you in approximately £30, you don't eat properly.
Really?
So what's happened, it's probably in the same way society, is we're becoming detached. The most vulnerable are becoming more vulnerable. You're looking at a basic unemployment is £2.50 a week in prison. Mm-hmm. A vape is £3.99.
A lot of people listening to that, Mark, will be fairly unsympathetic. They will say, well, prison actually is there, not just to protect us, but it's actually there to punish people.
Yeah, but when you look at the reconviction figures, 80% of the crime stats are reconvictions, cautions and reconvictions. It doesn't work. Here's the thing. My view of prison, I agree with, I think it's absolutely outrageous, the neglect that goes on amongst the vulnerable and volatile and criminal community in prison. It is absolutely scandalous. If you come to my prison, the one thing that you'd be faced with every single day, is the full facts about why you're there. And what I'm going to do is, if I'm the Ministry of Justice, is have a media and PR campaign to educate the public of literally watching these people being faced with their victims, being faced with the full consequence of their behaviour, and showing the public about the treatment that people need. Because I've never met anybody that comes in contact with this group of people in a therapy session, in a victim-led way, that walks away with the same opinion. I think we need to get involved in criminal justice. We need to be inquiring. This locking people up is so expensive. It's getting more expensive.
No, there's no doubt about that. But there's also, the other approach could be, last sort of final thought on this, that if you get people who are recidivist, repeat offenders, maybe the answer is to lock them up for longer.
Well, if we have a look at it, across the Atlantic in America, they lock people up for a very long time, and they've got 35% more reconviction figures than we have. The stats are, the data says it doesn't actually work.
America's got 5% of the world's population and 20% of the world's prisoners. I don't know the answer to this. I don't think any of us at the moment know the answer to this.
Well, the one thing that we don't do is we do not let people who commit crimes face them with the full facts of what they've done. We just don't do it.
I get the point. As ever, Mark Johnson, you make the points very powerfully. Thank you for coming in. In a moment, we'll be joined by Lee Sansom, former bodyguard to Diana, the Princess of Wales, and tonight, yes, just before midnight, UK time, 25 years ago today, she was involved in that fatal accident in Paris. We'll discuss all of that with a man who says, had he been there on the night, she wouldn't have died. Join my show, Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m, Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Well, it's Talking Pints, but tonight's going to be a very reflective Talking Pints, as often we are when we have a drink with each other. I'm joined by Lee Sansom. Lee, welcome to Talking Pints.
Thank you. Glad to meet you again.
It is a pretty extraordinary anniversary, isn't it? It was just before midnight, 25 years ago, that fatal accident. But before we get to that, you, soldier, Royal Military Police.
Yes.
And then doing all sorts of extraordinary things in Northern Ireland, sort of working undercover. And that was a damn dangerous job, wasn't it?
It was, Nigel, yeah. It was a war.
It was.
That we couldn't call a war, because it was on British soil, of course, because it would have damaged our economy. And, you know, the amount of service people and civilians and police that were killed there, it was thousands.
Yeah,
it's incredible.
We've kind of forgotten how bad it was.
We have, and at the height of, we call it the Troubles. That's a British thing to say, isn't it? It's a bit of trouble.
Yeah, a little bit of difficulty.
And sometimes, you know, I was sat in Belfast, or I worked in Belfast and down in South Armagh, bandit country as we called it then, and you'd hear all the explosions and everything going on, and you're thinking, nobody on mainland understands what's going on because it wasn't reported.
Well, and then, maybe it was underreported.
It was underreported, but I think it went on for that long. Everybody lost the...
Yeah.
You know...
Yeah, a little bit like maybe Ukraine is today. People sort of hear it, they switch off a little bit.
Yeah, it went on for so long. And don't forget the soldiers there. I could be in Belfast in the morning on patrol, fearing you were going to get shot at. In the afternoon, I could be sat in a pub in Manchester. And there was no decompression, there was nothing.
And all within the United Kingdom. No.
Crazy times.
And you go on and you're a martial arts coach and you become a bodyguard to the Hollywood stars. How does that happen?
Yes, it's... I think when I left the military in 1995, I'd worked with the military police, and they're well known for doing close protection in the military. They took over from the SAS, who handed it over to the military police, you know, years ago, and they refined the close protection world. So we had various close protection roles within the military police. And I knew a lot of my friends, you know, they served all over the world. So when I came out, I was determined not to go into security, but I just didn't. The transition to civilian life then was...
It's a pretty natural place to go, isn't it?
So I tried to do a couple of jobs. I just couldn't hold them down. So somebody said, look, there's a job going with the Al Fayed family.
Yep.
And Paul Hanley Greaves, who I'd known in the military, he was the head of security. So I gave him a call, and he said, look, come down. And he said, look, Lee, you know, I need you on my team, and that's when I started working in the close protection industry.
Yes.
The bodyguard industry.
Yeah, and you did a bit of work with Sylvester Stallone and all sorts of people over the years.
Yes, yeah, lots of different things. I've worked with... I've done some crazy stuff. I've been so lucky that I've done a diverse a role, I would say, from all sorts of stuff, from just crazy stuff.
And then it finishes up with you being a bodyguard, close protection for one of the most famous women in the world, and her kids
Yes.
And her boyfriend.
Yes.
Dodi Fayed.
Yes. Yeah.
And, you know, there you are. You're in the south of France. It's July 1997. And you seem to form... Well, it seems to me that you must have formed a remarkable bond with Diana, with the boys.
Yes.
Is that because you were a daredevil? Although this report that you were diving off the top of the yacht. Is that true?
It is true, yeah.
What happened? Come and tell us.
So it was during the end of the trip, and I was on the top deck of the super yacht, the Jonical.
So a long way up.
Massive boat. And I was talking to the princes, and Harry was a cheeky, naughty boy. And I loved him, and he reminded me of my son, who was a couple of years younger than Harry. And he said, you know, Lee, would you jump off this thing? I said, well, of course I would. Why? He said, well, jump off it. And I said, well, I'm not going to jump off it. I mean, I'm in my gear. We're ready to get you guys off onto the plane home. And he said, well, how much would you do it for? And I said, well, 200 quid.
How old is he at the time then?
He would have been
12 or 11.
Yeah, my boy was 10, I think. And he just disappeared. And all of a sudden I heard from down below, Lee, and it was the princess. Is it true you're going to jump off? I'm like, no. And she says, I've got the 200 quid. And I'm like, no, I've got to do it, haven't I now? So the captain of the boat, he was there, and he's like, Lee, you've got to be careful, because he had all the lines out. And he said, you've got to jump there.
Must be a long way down.
Yeah, because we were in the dock. But I'd said I'd do it, so anyway, off I jumped, and everyone was like clapping, and I came up, and the princess and Mr. Fayed was there, and he's just looking at me going, I knew you'd do it. And I got the 200 quid.
There you go, good. Well, it's a heck of a story. Well, you must have left the most extraordinary impression, because at the end of all this, there is a letter from Kensington Palace dated the 23rd of July, 1997. Dear Lee, yours sincerely, Diana, written in her own hand. And it says, William, Harry and I very much wanted to thank you for taking such good care of us during our stay in Saint-Tropez. We realise that our presence, along with that of the media, made your job enormously difficult, and for that we apologise. However, we all had a magical 10 days, which would not have been possible without your invaluable contribution, and for that we all send our warmest possible thanks. It's not just signed by Diana, it's signed by the boys as well.
How nice.
That is a remarkable thing, isn't it?
It's one of the last probably the last letter that all three of them signed. But how nice was that, you know, Nigel?
Unbelievable.
So I'm at home, and I've looked after a lot of people with egos and all this kind of stuff. And there's that lady,
amazing,
with all that stuff going on, and she has time to do that.
You must have left the most remarkable impression upon her. Now, that's dated July 23rd, so we're only going forward just shy of 5 weeks until tonight.
I know. It's
25 years ago. Now, you weren't there, were you, on the night?
I wasn't in Paris, no. But, you know, I could have been. We drew straws to see who would go.
So you could have been there.
So you had Trevor East-Jones.
Yes.
You know, great guy, great operator, a friend of mine. And then you had Kes Wingfield, who was there. There was two of them, obviously, to look after the princess as well. And Kes was on. We'd put him in solitary on one of the boats because he had the flu, so he didn't spread it to the team and the guests. And there's about 5 of us, the bodyguards, as you were saying. And Mr. Fayed said, "Look, we need somebody to go with the princess around on the Mediterranean trip." And we didn't want to go because we were tired. We'd had a long summer. So we thought we'd draw straws. So we put, so there's 5 of us there. We put 6 straws in because Kes was one, and he was on the boat. And one of the guys drew the short straw, and he said, "I guess that's Kes's then."
Yeah.
So we all said, "Right, Kes, we're going."
Yeah.
So so it could have been anybody.
Could have been anybody. Now, as it turns out, there's all sorts of conspiracy theory, but one thing that I'm struck by is Diana. During that period you were with her, there was the Versace murder, wasn't there?
Yes, there was, yeah.
And the friendship there was very strong?
Yes, extremely, yeah.
And she was worried for her own safety?
She was, yeah. Yeah, she was worried. And when she spoke to me about it, I just bumped into her on the top of the Jonical, the super yacht.
Yeah.
And she turned round, and she'd obviously been crying a lot. And we'd been talking about Versace that morning. Everybody thought he'd been assassinated by a hitman at the time. It turned out to be something slightly different. So at that time, we thought it was a professional hit, and everybody thought that in the world. And she turned round, and then she said to me, "Lee, have you heard about my friend?" And which I had, and I said, "Yes, I have." And she spoke about him, and then she said, "Do you think they'll do that to me?"
They.
Yes, and with real fear and vulnerability. So I'm now on this top deck with windows similar to this.
Yeah.
With windows, and you've got all paparazzi, and she walks towards me. And we're human beings, right? You would just want to hug somebody and just say, "Look, you're okay." I couldn't do that. You imagine if the paparazzi.
Dear, oh dear. Yeah.
So I took a step back and assured her that we had a great professional team. We were going to look after her, and kind of made her feel a little bit better. And as she was feeling a bit better, I said, "Look, I've got to go now." And I made a sharp exit. But
she was being trailed, wasn't she, by British security?
Yes.
I mean, in that tunnel.
Yeah.
In that tunnel, and I listen. I don't go along with any of the conspiracy theories that she was knocked off and all this, but I absolutely don't. But the two motorbikes.
Yeah.
One going incredibly quickly.
Yeah.
That may well have been the cause of that accident. I don't know.
We never know.
We don't know. But we never ever identified who was riding those motorbikes.
This is the thing. I gave evidence at the coroner's inquest, and my evidence of me speaking to people on high-powered motorbikes in Saint-Tropez who were former military. Now, when I meet former military, the language that you speak, they're former military, and they were former military. There's me and a friend of mine. We'd blocked the road to stop them coming down so the princess could get on the boat and go away with the princes. And it was all. I had this master plan on this small road. We opened the doors of the armoured vehicle so they couldn't get past. Now, this is the thing that people don't understand. Our security services and our intelligence services are the best in the world. And they keep us safe, and they do an amazing job. Now, could you imagine that...
They're very good at hiding too, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what. This is the thing.
Yeah.
But the thing is, they weren't there in Saint-Tropez, according to the powers that be, or in Paris. Now, the thing is, imagine if the head of the intelligence service or the head of the royal family or whoever said, "Do you know where Princess Diana is at this moment in time and the heir to the throne?" And they went, "We haven't got a clue."
Yeah, of course.
It's ridiculous.
Of course.
But I
So it's possible that accident was caused by those motorbikes. It is possible.
I don't think so, because our security services are so professional. But what I do believe is that somebody was there that saw what happened, and they were part of either the French, ours, or a combination, and they were there, and they couldn't seem to be there. And I think that's caused some anomalies in the investigation, which the conspiracy theorists jump on.
I fed in.
And
Lee,
I believe it was just an accident.
No, so do I. Lee, you say if you were there, you could have saved her life.
Well, this is the thing. If I'd have been there, I had a big thing about seatbelts. Mr. Fired would sack you if he saw a member of his family without a seatbelt on. It was a big thing. When I first drove Dodie, he got in the car. He hated seatbelts, and probably he lived a lot of the time in the States, where it's pretty not mandatory. But I asked him to put the seatbelt on, and he said, "Look, Lee, I'm not putting the seatbelt on." So I said, "Well, I'm not driving the car." He said, "No, you're driving the car. You tell me where you're going to take me." He was in London, and I said, "Well, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to phone your father, and you can speak to him." And he went, "Seatbelt on." Right. Every time I saw him, now I've worked over in the war zones in Somalia, Libya, where there's rockets flying at us and rounds being, but I ensure everybody must have the seatbelts on.
She wasn't wearing a seatbelt.
Unfortunately.
If you'd been there, you'd have made sure she did.
Yeah, as I would if I drove you or your family.
No, I get it. Tomorrow, September the 1st, you've got a book coming out. Tell us
I
about
have,
it.
yeah. Well, I wrote the book in lockdown. It's about my life. There's a couple of chapters about the princess in there, but we all know everybody loved the princess.
Yep.
And it's about my life.
Yep. There we go.
Yeah. And all the various things I've done all over the world, in security and in martial arts, and
well, you've done plenty.
Nice love story in there as well.
I want to say, Lee, thank you for joining me on Talking Pints.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
OK, I've got 2 minutes left with you. It's Farage the Farage. Let's see what I've got. One viewer asks, what 3 words sum up Boris's tenure to you? What a waste. It was an old Ian Jury song, wasn't it? What a waste. What a waste. An 80-seat majority, loved by loads of people in the public, a chance for great reform. It didn't happen. It's just so sad. It's just such a waste. Rob asks, has Starmer lost control of the Labour Party and are the unions taking over? Well, look, in terms of the funding of the Labour Party, the unions are completely in control. Well over 85% of Labour funding comes direct from the trade unions. It's why Lord Mandelson and others are urging Starmer to get out and try and raise some money. Perhaps they'll bring back Lord Levy. Who knows? Has Starmer lost control? Do you know what? He may have no personality. He may have no policies, but he's dealt with the left. The right people in the Labour movement hate him. And that actually puts him in a much stronger position than Jeremy Corbyn. You might not find reasons to vote for Keir Starmer, but there aren't actually the really powerful reasons to vote against him that there were in the Midlands and the North, in what we became, to understand as the Red Wall, when it came to Corbyn. I actually think when it comes to the hard left, he's done a little bit better than many of us give him credit for. And finally, ketchup or brown sauce with your full English. Tim? I do love a full English. I went to the butcher's last Saturday and loaded up with sausage and bacon. And it's got to be brown sauce. I've got to tell you, with sausages, I do actually like quite a hint of English mustard made freshly from the powder as well. I quite like that. And I've got time for one more. Robert asks, would you rank Gorbachev as one of the greatest politicians of our era? I thought it was very interesting for us to be able to see Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev. And whatever you think of their individual policies on the economy or whatever it may be, there is little question, very little question, that by the end of all of their tenures, the world was a safer place than when they'd all come to power. And that was a pretty remarkable thing. Over to you, Mark Stein.
I like the full English, and then I had the Ulster Fry when I was in Northern Ireland.
That's the real deal.
Yeah, the Ulster Fry makes the full English look like a little Nancy Boy Continental breakfast. It's fairly frightening, that. Thank you, Nigel. Terrific show. We're going to try and keep it going. For the next hour, we have one of the great glories of British broadcasting. Sue Cook is with us, and we will look at how bad it's going to get. How fast? That's all coming up after the weather. On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark